Vanessa, welcome to the Healthpath podcast. It's really nice to be able to connect.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I was just saying before we started recording, I guess for our listeners, I read a little interview that you did in the ICANN magazine around your work around grief. And it really resonated ultimately. I thought it was a really powerful piece. And obviously, within that, your book is mentioned. So I then went and read your book and thought it would just be a really, hopefully powerful, I think really relevant and important topic for both health practitioners to maybe know a little bit more about, but also something we're all going to experience if we haven't already. And therefore, from that perspective, just a really important conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that in mind, unless you think, Vanessa, there's a sort of a better place to start, I'm wondering whether we kind of just dive in with the sort of the different types of grief that there are.
Yeah, we can do that. I think this is the misconception if you haven't perhaps had much experience of loss, is that you think, oh, well, grief, you just feel sad for a bit and then you get over it. But of course, grief is very varied. It depends on the loss. You're going to feel very differently if you lose an elderly parent who's in their 90s and has had a nice long life, to if you lose a baby or a child. Um, so normal grief would be a loss that doesn't completely throw you off balance, that you feel naturally sad, but in time you get used to it and you think of them fondly and you get on with your life. So that's normal grief. That's what everyone assumes grief is. Uh, but then there are so many other types like anticipatory grief. So this would be if you're basically waiting for someone to die. You know they're not very well, they perhaps got cancer, it's a long illness, but you don't know when they're going to go. So this is really stressful. And this is a great type of grief for nutritional therapists, functional medicine practitioners to come in and help with the stress, and make sure people aren't living off coffee and adrenaline. So if you're working with someone already and you know perhaps their father is in hospital and you can sort of support them, but to an extent. The good thing about anticipatory grief as well is that you get a chance to say goodbye, and that's so important. So that's a sort of plus side to it, for want of a better expression, because obviously it's incredibly painful if you're watching the demise of someone. Um, so yeah, delayed grief is another form of grief. And that is when you perhaps, it might be, a good example would be a woman who loses her husband, but has to get on with supporting her children. So she might delay her grief even until the children leave home, or maybe when they've just gone to bed. But it can be quite an extended period with delayed grief. Um, and then we've got traumatic grief. Traumatic grief, obviously, it does what it says on the tin. It's when there's trauma involved. So this is, for example, an out of order death, when someone dies unexpectedly. So an out of order death is obviously when a young person dies, and it's not the natural scheme of things. But traumatic grief can be just witnessing someone die in the street, or that you don't even know, or finding someone's body, and there's often a diagnosis of PTSD. Um, so traumatic grief is really, I've experienced traumatic grief with the loss of my son and my husband, and it is horrendous. So it's probably the worst kind of grief. Cumulative grief, again, fairly self-explanatory. It's when you have one loss and then another and then another. And sometimes if they're in quick succession, you don't get a chance to fully grieve and the next one comes along. So again, there can be complex PTSD with this. Then there's prolonged grief. which again is when it's extended. This has actually got a diagnosis of, if your grief isn't so supposedly completed in a year, then it's termed as a mental health issue. But there's huge controversy over this because, of course, most grief, like loss of a child, isn't going to be resolved in a year. Collective grief will be, when the Queen dies and everyone comes together and there's a public mourning. So that's collective grief. So I hope that kind of explains that there's more, but that's just a handful of examples.
Yeah, I think it really helps because it brings a bit of kind of reality to the concept, I guess, ultimately. You listing those, I can start to think of examples in my own life or it's a life of someone I know, and you go, okay. So I think that's a really nice sort of place to start ultimately. So thank you for sharing those. And I think the next kind of big thing is, especially with a chunk of our listeners being healthcare practitioners, and particularly nutritional therapists and functional medicine practitioners, for some it might seem obvious, but I think I'd imagine for some it won't be, which is there is this kind of, you've touched on the mental impact that certain types of trauma and grief can have, but there's also, I guess, an increasing amount of research showing us that there's a physical sort of element to this as well that we really need to be mindful of. So you happy to kind of expand on that side of things?
Yes, and do jump in if you want me to talk about anything specific. I think as I'm a nutritional therapist and wellbeing coach, but because of my own experience and the physical experience of grief, which was so surprising to me, but then not when you think that grief is a major stress, and so your body, if there's trauma involved, is going to the body keeps a score, so your body will do all kinds of things that are quite surprising if you haven't experienced that type of grief. So I now work as a holistic grief coach. So I'm seeing this with a lot of my clients, that it's a whole being, I describe it as a whole being experience because it affects mind, body, and spirit. But because of my background as a nutritional therapist, I kind of thought, well, this is an area I can kind of really explore and help people with. And for my book, I was asked to do a lot of research. So but grief and trauma can wreak absolute havoc on the body. One area that it is quite surprising is how it affects the brain. So it can cause memory loss, confusion, forgetfulness, brain fog, or grief fog as it's known. And this is surprisingly common, particularly in a traumatic loss. And these grief symptoms are often referred to as a traumatic brain injury, which I think is quite surprising and shocking if you haven't heard about that before. And I use an example of a grief coaching client who described her brain feeling like it was swollen and stuffed with cotton wool. And I think that's a really good way of explaining it for anyone who doesn't have that experience. So sleep can have something to do with these brain type grief symptoms, but it's mainly to do with the cortisol just flooding the body. And a traumatized brain is just going to work really extra hard because it's overactive, and that's absolutely exhausting. And this can go on. It's not just it's over in the first few weeks. It might be in some cases, but not always. Every single person is different. A whole different set of circumstances come together. And so everyone's experience of grief is entirely different. So we know that for practitioners who are listening, just imagine the biggest stress ever, and that can be grief. And so we know that's going to affect the endocrine, immune, nervous, digestive, and cardiovascular systems. And it's going to increase inflammation quite dramatically. And I found one study when I was researching for my book that showed that the higher levels of inflammation correlated with the severity of grief. So the more intense the grief, the higher the levels of inflammation is what they found. So that's the ramifications, I think, of that, are quite enormous. So yeah, and new illnesses can appear out of nowhere. Maybe symptoms that had receded come back. So yeah, and some of the research I found, which I think is really quite worth sharing about the effects of grief. One example was studies show becoming widowed is associated with an increase in risk of mortality of between 48 and 68% within the first few months of bereavement, which is kind of like, when I read that, I was like, wow, okay. And the likelihood of bereaved parents having a sudden cardiac death rises significantly following the death of a child. Well, I think most people will kind of expect that. But also traumatic grief symptoms can precede illnesses like cancer. Then there's broken heart syndrome, which really does exist. And again, for practitioners, it's quite interesting to bear in mind that it's mostly found in postmenopausal women, and it can look like heart disease. So on a scan, it looks like heart disease, but it's known as reversible heart disease, because provided the grief is addressed and it's not suppressed, then it can be reversible. But of course, addressing the kind of grief that might have caused broken heart syndrome is no easy matter. So it's not going to be straightforward. So yeah, that's kind of just like a little overview. Obviously, it impacts mental health as well. So yeah, but those are the effects really that it can have on the body, which is quite dramatic, quite surprising, I think, for lots of people.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you make the really great point in your book around us NTs, nutritional therapists, often have a sort of, we're going to have a fix it mentality. We do what we do because we hope to fix imbalances, issues. That's why our clients sort of partly come to us. And even listening to you there, knowing this point in your book, like, it's interesting to think where my thoughts go in regards to everything you talk about, how it impacts the digestive system and nervous system. And you go to, oh, well, maybe these things would be really helpful. And I guess it's a challenge maybe for us is appreciating and accepting that that does have a place, but simultaneously appreciating that maybe slightly more of a somatic sort of embodied approach may be needed. You start thinking of Dr. Gabor Mate and Peter Levine and that sort of side of things, where this energy, this emotion needs to be integrated, mobilized, metabolized, whatever words you want to use. And I think that can be, it's a real challenge ultimately to hold both simultaneously, that acceptance and desire to support and to improve, or whatever, again, whatever word you might use.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think one of the big messages I wanted to get across to practitioners was, you can't fix this. You can support. And I know I was guilty before, I had my own experience of grief. You'd have a questionnaire, you'd go through it, you'd have a limited time period, you'd ask someone about a loss, and then you'd kind of move on. But actually, one of the best things we can do as practitioners is just listen to someone. And if it comes up, that's probably going to be better than any kind of supplement you can suggest. Is just to allow them to tell their story, to feel listened to, because grievers often feel they're not listened to. They need to have their experience validated for someone to go, God, that must be really hard. I'm so sorry. Tell me about the person you lost. But I totally agree. Somatic work is everything. Obviously, things like looking at the gut are going to be hugely supportive, supplements for the nervous system, but that's just a piece of it. It's not everything. It has to be a combination of things. But ultimately we can't fix it. And it was my instinct was to fix myself. When my son died, I was like, okay, literally the day after he died, I went onto the natural dispensary, filled my basket. I know it's tragic, because it literally is tragic, because I thought that's what I went to, what I knew. But sometimes things don't touch the sides, you know. So, but it can come, things can come in later on, and it's still worth doing, but you're not going to be able to fix everything.
And it's so interesting what you say there around, it's what you knew. And I guess, there's safety in what we know ultimately.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Vanessa, on this sort of, I guess, concept that for those with a sort of chronic complex illness, that part of that process, there's also potentially grief there as well, grief over their kind of their former self, their old lifestyle that maybe they don't have anymore, maybe they won't ever have again. It's something that I sort of came to mind when I was listening to you around. I think grief can be a quite common for nutritional therapists from a health perspective, so to speak.
Yes, I mean, grief doesn't have to just be for losing a person. It can be if you have, say, for example, chronic fatigue syndrome, you may well, and you're bedbound, you're going to grieve your old life. So I think I always feel with grief generally, because now although I'm still a nutritional therapist, I'm working at all aspects of grief. I get a lot of people saying they want to go back to how they were. And I think this is probably true for lots of things, really, is that we can't go back. We can only go forward, and that we will be changed by whatever experience, whether it's ill health or a bereavement. We're changed, and we have to accept that and move forward. um it's like the time heals. Well, it doesn't necessarily. It can do, but not in every instance. You're never going to get over the death of a child, for example. So yeah, it's a question of accepting that you have to let go of who you were. For whatever reason, you're changed,
Okay.
whether it's a loss or it's a health issue. I don't know if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. It makes total sense. I think, this idea of acceptance is such a big one within that sort of area. And definitely, I follow a few people on sort of social media that sort of specialize in grief, and it's definitely one of those things you hear around, time doesn't heal everything. And that kind of, we're going to be touching on this maybe in a little bit in regards to some of the things that we do say and maybe reasons why we say these things. But that kind of act as acceptance and commitment therapy, I guess, could be helpful from this perspective, just to help people accept there's a new norm ultimately.
Yeah, and you don't have to like it. You don't have to like it. I think I'm very hot on toxic positivity, spiritual bypassing, because I see a lot of that. But acceptance, you can accept something and also not like it.
Yeah, that's
Um,
feels an important point.
yes, I
Yeah.
think so.
Okay. Um, and then on my notes, the next thing I've got is actually sort of platitudes. Um,
Yeah.
so this, I guess, is in some ways sort of a challenging one, and I think for lots of different reasons. But this deeply resonated with me just from a personal perspective, and it's again, I guess a lot of these things, I'm fascinated by paradox these days and sort of being able to simultaneously hold sometimes conflicting information and sort of just holding it in that space. And it feels a little bit like maybe there's something here around that. But are you happy just to kind of touch on a little bit what you share in your book around platitudes?
Yeah. Um, I think the thing is, death, nobody wants to think about it. People do not want to confront their own mortality or those of people they love. So they just want it all to stop and go away. So when they're confronted by a grieving person, someone they know very well, or maybe someone they know less well, they really kind of just don't know what to say. They feel uncomfortable. It's the elephant in the room. And unfortunately, I do think that bereaved parents and widows and widowers get the worst of this because these are the losses that are terrifying for people. Um, and losing a child is relatively rare, but it's not that rare. Widows and widowers are a bit more common. So, the chances are people are going to come across these losses, but they just don't know what to do with them. And being a bereaved mother myself and a widow, uh, but bereaved parents generally will say this. This is so typical that people will literally cross the road to avoid them. I mean, you can be walking down a supermarket aisle and somebody will kind of be like a rabbit in the headlights and pretend they haven't seen you. And this is so hurtful. It's better to say something than nothing at all would be my advice to anyone listening. But yeah, but people don't know what to say. Yeah, a few of the things, few examples, what not to say, the platitudes, time heals all wounds, which we kind of said, we've touched on. But yes, Bob Geldof said, because he lost a daughter, and he says, time doesn't heal, it accommodates. And so that's another way of putting it a bit more accurately. And time does heal a lot of things in life, but not everything. Yeah, a bereaved parent will never get over the loss of their child. It's as simple as that. Other people, this is a really common one. People will say, I know how you feel. And then they'll say to, for example, a bereaved parent how they've lost their elderly uncle or something. And that's really a bit, they mean well. People always mean well, but try and avoid saying, I know how you feel. I won't even say it to another bereaved mother or a widow because I don't know how they feel. I know something of their experience, but not exactly the same. So it's best to avoid that one. At least you can have other children, or at least you have other children. I think that's meant well, but it shows a complete lack of understanding. And I think, if you've lost a child and they go, well, at least you've got another one. It's, well, which of your children would you give up? Which of your children could you do without? And to somebody who's lost a baby or had a miscarriage, to say, oh, yes, you can have other children. Well, maybe, but don't say it. Don't say it because all you want is the one that you've lost. Oh, and one of my favorite things that people say is they wouldn't want you to be sad. And I always just go, yeah, but they'd understand why I am because, you know, and that's just other people wanting you not to be sad in front of them. A lot of it is quite sort of selfish, I think. Yeah, and things like God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Again, I think that's a very dodgy one, really, because that's can often be why people take their own lives because they've been given too much to handle. So that's not a good one either. Yeah, and then asking directly how someone died. can be very triggering. Yeah, wait till somebody tells you, because if you ask, it sounds nosy. Um, it could take somebody right back to the trauma, which could be very triggering. So that's not a good one. And anything around think positive, look on the, things will get better. You don't know that. They might do. Hopefully they will, but don't make assumptions, and don't, it's sort of invalidating. It's minimizing someone's experience. And that's what I hear a lot from bereaved people, that they have their experience minimized. Yeah. So I think those are the main ones, unless you can remember any other I mentioned in the book, or any of your particular favorites.
Um, One thing you did say there that has reminds me another a really important point I felt within the book was don't, I mean, I might not get this 100% accurate, but it was along the lines of, sometimes we might have a client who is very dark or very direct in their language. And that doesn't mean that we should mirror that, because it might just be one of their mechanisms at that point in time. I thought that was a really important insight.
Yeah, it's a trauma response. So when I work with bereaved mothers, particularly, they just have this dark humor. And I'm sort of allowed to reciprocate, but they'll tell me stories, and I know myself of other people responding to that, and they don't like it. Grief makes you very sensitive. And I think, if you've lost your partner and you're with somebody who's got a partner, or if somebody's talking about their children and your child's died, there needs to be just a real sensitivity around it, I think. Yeah, it's a minefield. But yeah, very much just sit and listen, rather than kind of, I think we often, as practitioners, we want to create rapport. So we think, oh, we'll go along, or they're using humor, or they're talking in terms that are very stark, or whatever. But it's okay for them to do it. It's not okay really for us to do it. We could fall into that trap, and that could sort of create distance rather than the rapport we might be trying to achieve.
Um, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention that's escaped me now. It might come back. Oh, yes, that's it. I guess I introduced this idea of platitudes in what probably came across as quite a cryptic way, but you kind of answered or expanded on why I sort of was talking about it being a paradox, because I think at least sometimes, our loved ones might be saying some of these things to us. And as you say, it's really because they don't know what to say. They might be feeling very uncomfortable that we're feeling the way we are. So they're sort of trying to downplay it to make us feel better, as you say. And so it can come from a good intention, I guess, sometimes, but
Yeah,
it just comes from the fact, I think, as a society, maybe we're not very good at sitting in uncomfortable emotions. And
no.
it's a big area where education's probably needs to really think about it ultimately.
Yeah, it's a really grief-averse society. People are uncomfortable. They just don't want to confront it. And particularly with partner loss and child loss, they're the worst losses. They're everyone's worst nightmare. So they really want to avoid it. And if they happen to, that's kind of like more friends or acquaintances. But if it's actual family members, they just want you to feel better. They love you and they want you to feel better. And they don't really know how to do that. It's been quite interesting with my first book, which is really a memoir. It's called Love Untethered: How to Live When Your Child Dies. And what I've found with the response I've got for that book is that people have said, and I gave it to family members. And I thought that says everything, really, that they just want to go, look, it's not just me. Here's another woman telling you what it's like. Uh, um, Yeah, I think, of course, it's hard for anyone to understand. That's when people say, I can't imagine. Well, they don't want to imagine, but yeah, unfortunately, that feels quite insulting to the person it's said to, because it's like, well, lucky you, you don't have to imagine. I've got to live with it every day. So it creates a sort of distance and disconnect.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a really brilliant example of where giving those sorts of books can be so helpful because that's the insight that's required ultimately, I guess. People that have been there are receiving the comments who are then sharing the consequences, as it were.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
okay, thoughts keep coming in and coming up. There's something else that I just wanted to expand on, but maybe it will come back. Thank you for all of those. I think it's really helpful. It has come back. And it was around, I can't actually quite remember in your book if there are some suggestions of things to say or do. I think there are certainly some around, what to do, but I'm wondering, even just like, is there anything I can do for you? If it is maybe a friend that you're seeing and just like seeing what they want rather than thinking that you need to come up with the thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think um certainly bringing food, bringing food, leaving it is great, because if it's a sudden loss particularly, or even if it's not, people don't feel like eating, they don't certainly don't feel like making anything. So bringing food is something you can do. The other thing is you can keep texting, don't expect a response, don't kind of go, oh, she didn't respond, she won't want to hear from me. Keep texting, um and say, please let me know if there's anything I can do. I would be happy to, and then give a list of suggestions. So don't be sort of vague. Say, can I go to the shops for you? Would you like me to bring this? If there are young kids, could I take the kids for a play date? That would be a great one. Um, just doing practical things certainly is really helpful, rather than just being vague, and keep asking, and don't suddenly disappear, because you get a lot of people rallying around initially and then they just disappear. And I mean, actually, what's quite interesting, when people lose a parent, which is the natural order of things, one of the things they say to me is, after about 2 weeks, nobody asks anymore. I think for partner loss and child loss, it goes on a bit longer because those are shocking losses. But still, people get on with their own lives. They're not so focused on you. Everyone rallies around initially, and then it's a very lonely, isolating experience. People fall away. People complain that they have less friends than they used to. I hear that all the time. So stick with your friend who's bereaved as long as you can, and be there in any way that you're able to. And if you're a practitioner, even if perhaps they haven't worked with you, just check in and go, just, thinking of you, share an article, share a book idea, whatever. That's just that's being kind, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that is so interesting that that's a common experience. And I guess
Yeah.
testament to what we've already said around our nature as a society and our relationships to some of these things.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and I guess, moving on from there, and obviously, Vanessa, if there's anything that you want to share or if there's something we've left out on any of these things, do say. But um, you've already mentioned some things that friends, colleagues, loved ones can do if someone's going through grief. I wonder whether, and this is going to have to maybe be quite high level, but thinking from a practitioner perspective, we've touched on sort of the physical elements of things. So I'm wondering whether there are some sort of common themes that come up in your work that we could sort of touch on, whether that's just areas of health or behavioral challenges, as you said, like just preparing food can be incredibly challenging and these sorts of things. So for practitioners listening,
For
are there...
practitioners listening, well, first of all, uh, if you happen to be working with someone and during that time they have a loss and they suddenly go, all the things you've taught them and they were doing so well, go out of the window, allow it. Just allow it. They go, oh, well, I'm just getting takeaways, or I haven't eaten, or I'm drinking too much. Allow it, because they don't know where they are, if it's sudden or it's, and then in time, obviously, you can come back to it. If all they're doing is eating cake that someone's brought, then allow it, and just be there to support them in gentle, mainly just listening to them. But obviously things like, as practitioners, we do often, I mean, I'll come back to the nutritional therapy ideas, but we often suggest other things like books or breath work, which cannot be underestimated. It's so important. Uh, just getting out in nature, obvious things, but are worth reminding. Just go for a walk, things like that. Obviously, we're looking at stress. So what you'd normally do with a client who is under a great deal of stress. So nervous system support, obviously the gut, serotonin is shown to be low in grief. So serotonin, obviously, we know, is made in the gut. So that's obviously the foundations, as we know, of everything. I think, obviously, the vagus nerve, the connection between the gut and the nervous system. If you're on high alert, cortisol and adrenaline, then you've got the whole issue with rest and digest. Some of the symptoms in early grief will be nausea, lack of appetite, headaches, or you name it, anything goes really. Those do tend to calm down eventually. But yeah, and things for trauma, things like the things that we would do to support the vagus nerve. So things like breathing techniques, meditation, cold showers, splashing the face with water, connecting with nature, all these things are going to help. Obviously, looking at blood sugar balance, that's another one, which is difficult if somebody's lost their appetite. So what things can you suggest that they could digest quite easily? I mean, keep ideas really simple. Obviously, nutrients that are going to be helpful, magnesium. Obviously, the higher the magnesium, that helps with lowering cortisol. Things like vitamin D, B vitamins for stress, vitamin C for the adrenals, omega-3, ashwagandha, which, we know can be great for lowering cortisol. Did I say cholesterol? Cortisol. And low mood. So one of the supplements I suggest a lot is saffron, Crocus sativus. So I would say that ashwagandha are two of the additional things that I would use in grief. But I get good results with saffron, and that when somebody has had a terrible loss, they will often go to their GP, who will give them antidepressants. So I think we need to come up with something as an alternative. So I think Crocus sativus has undergone quite a few trials. And I think the trials showed that the effects are as good as antidepressants, but without the side effects. You don't have to be weaned off. They don't take a long time to work. When I use saffron myself, I will feel better within a few hours.
Wow.
But when I say better, it's all relative.
Yes, yeah.
I'm still grieving. I'm still sad. but I'm just feeling like, oh, I feel slightly better. Yeah, I can cope a little bit more. So we mustn't expect things to work miracles in grief.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that's really helpful. And, it's nice to know that there are those things there. And the word that came to mind as you shared those sorts of considerations was, I guess, an overarching theme just needs to be sort of convenience, sort of slash simplicity with this as well.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, keep it simple, and compliance may not be what it would be in a, inverted commas, normal client. You just have to be quite patient. Uh, yeah, and get them to write everything down. I think that's one of the things I suggested, because with brain fog, grief brain, whatever you want to call it, they're more forgetful. They can't keep things. I think there's an author called Megan Devine, who's a psychotherapist and a widow, and she says, imagine you have 100 units to do everything in your life. Well, when you're grieving, it's like you've just, got one to use. Everything else is taken up with grief, sadness, trauma. So yeah, it's challenging. But yeah, I can't remember what were you asking me then. I went off on a tangent there,
Oh,
but
that was great. It was sort of the practitioner orientated considerations, but I think you've covered that pretty well ultimately. So
just see it as a major stress.
yeah, yeah. And I think when you're coming at it from a nutritional therapy perspective with that sort of systems biology, functional medicine perspective, it's helpful fundamentally because we can understand that these different bodily systems are all interconnected, and that that trauma, that stress is going to potentially disrupt all of it ultimately.
Yeah. And when they're further along in their grief journey, one of the things I do suggest is, because obviously I work holistically with a client, so I'm looking at mind, body, and spirit. But often I'll say, because when you've lost someone, you've had no control. We have no control. We couldn't change it. The one thing we can have control over in our lives is what we put into our body. So it often comes to a point where you go, right, I'm going to suggest some nutritional advice to this person I'm working with, because it might make them feel there's something they can do. They can't control the person they've lost going, they can't control their sadness or anything else, but they can make themselves feel as well as they can through what they put into their body, taking supplements to support themselves. And it just feels a bit empowering. So you have a bit of control in a world where you've had no control. So I'll often use that argument with them to try and help them, feel a little bit better. But it's not the be all and end all. And that's what, as practitioners, we have to know. It's so complex. And actually, the one area that I find is positive in grief is that often people will have a little bit of a spiritual awakening, because they start questioning life, death, the afterlife. What's it all about? Trying to make sense of what's happened.
Yeah.
And so the things that I'll suggest are ways that they can move forward are things like the continuing bonds theory, which is where, in the old days, it'd be like, well, let's keep calm and carry on, stiff upper lip, just closure, moving on. Whereas now we don't sort of feel that we have to just not think about them or not talk about them. So they have shown the continuing bonds theory to be the healthiest way to grieve. So you just keep you keep talking to them, talking about them, you honor them. If it's their birthday, you can make a cake. If you want, you can obviously go to their grave, lay flowers, the usual things, but you can do all kinds of things. You can start watching their favorite series that you never watched before, or support their favorite football team, or anything. You can have it's very difficult to explain to people who haven't gone through a really bad loss, but you can have almost like an area in your house. People love this, where they will have photographs, candles, maybe bring flowers, whatever. And I think in other cultures that's common, but we tend to think, oh God, why are they doing that? But it's helpful. It's part of healing, you know? So yeah, I think there's lots of ways that we can support people and make suggestions outside of nutrition. It doesn't, you know,
Yeah.
groups, support groups for bereaved parents, for widows. There's lots of those around. Yeah, and allow them to talk if they want to say, I believe, you know, that they're in the afterlife, or I found a feather. It doesn't even matter what it is. Just kind of go, oh, that's wonderful, because that will keep them, you know, connected to their loved one and help the healing process. And we want to do anything to help their healing. You know, it doesn't have to just be through nutrition. We want them to heal in any way that they can.
Yeah. And I guess having a referral network is just another good example of how important that is ultimately.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Definitely. Just going back to what I was saying, the amount of clients that I have who are on antidepressants, though, because that's all that's offered to them. And then maybe a bit of bereavement counselling, which can be okay, but in lots of cases it's just not.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess one of the areas of the book we haven't touched on, that we don't need to. I don't want to kind of just divulge the entire book, but is around sort of the theory of grief versus and the models that are out there compared to the reality. And I guess, the one of the takeaways there is they don't necessarily align.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what probably I imagine most people have um, heard of is the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief theory, which is a denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And she actually wrote a book called The 5 Stages of, I think it's called, of Dying. And that's what those stages were for. That she didn't write them for grief. So if someone was dying, she said the stages you go through are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But they sort of got hijacked. And everyone thought, right, this is what you have to go through. And therapists have picked up on this and run with it. And then you get people who are grieving, feeling like they're a failure because they're not getting through the stages quick enough, and that these stages are linear, and that I've got to get to acceptance. And the reality of grief is that you will feel all kinds of things aside from those feelings, and that you'll go back and forwards. You might start to accept elements of your grief, and then you'll go back to the beginning, but they're not linear. There's so much more to it, and it's such a and it's become part of our sort of cultural consciousness that, oh, the 5 stages of grief, so this is what it'll be like, this is what I have to get through, and then I'll be okay. And the grief will magically be over. So David Kessler, who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I trained to be a grief educator with him, he actually added a 6th stage called finding meaning. So he believes you have to find meaning not in the death, but in your life after loss. And that is one way, and that's basically what I'm doing. You can do this by helping others in the same position. But really any way to find meaning in your life, that finding closure is old school. We don't have to do that anymore, and David Kessler also says, when people ask, how long will you grieve? He says, how long will your person be dead? So, yeah. Yeah, and then there's something called post-traumatic growth, which is quite interesting. So this will usually apply to a sort of profound life-changing loss, which shifts someone on a very deep level. And I think it is possible to experience grief and PTSD and also experience post-traumatic growth. So the post-traumatic growth might include finding a new purpose in life, helping others who've experienced a similar tragedy, becoming more compassionate, a deepening spirituality, or discovering a strength you never knew you had. So these are all ways people can grow from their grief. But it's important to understand that not everyone does, you know. So yeah, I think the main aim is to grieve fully and live fully as much as you can when you've had a profound loss. Yeah, so trying to cultivate post-traumatic growth, it doesn't take away the pain, but it can just give you a reason to carry on, to go forward and honor the person that you've lost.
That's beautifully put. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm mindful of our time, so I will kind of ask my sort of typical question, which is there anything that you want to conclude with? Is there anything that you want to share that we haven't touched on or re-emphasize?
I think just understand, just sit with someone where they are. Don't try and fix them, whether you're a practitioner or a friend or a family member. You'll never fully understand and you can't make it better, but you can walk alongside them. You can hold their hand. You can listen with compassion. And that's the main message, I suppose. Just be with them where they are and don't try and change them. Allow them their feelings. I think probably that would be it.
And I will add to that, there are wonderful books like yours.
Thank you.
Be really valuable in helping us understand these things. And I think, they are some of the more important topics that we need to be kind of read up on or need to listen to these sorts of conversations because we're all going to be in that experience
Yeah,
at least, well, several times fundamentally. So yes, I will say thank you for your work, thank you for your time today, thank you for your message. I'm really looking forward to sharing this with everyone.
thank you. You're welcome.